The man at the door wasn't security in the traditional sense. He wasn't wearing a uniform, he wasn't carrying a badge. He was just a large man in a blazer who my brother Tanner had apparently called the night before and asked to stand in the hallway of our family attorney's office on Meeting Street in Charleston, South Carolina, in case things got complicated, in case I got complicated. Things didn't get complicated, I walked out on my own. What I couldn't walk away from was Tanner's face as I left, the particular expression of a 34-year-old man who has just watched his older brother be told he doesn't legally exist as family and who finds this outcome deeply, genuinely satisfying. He didn't laugh the way some men would. He smiled. Slow, deliberate, the smile of someone who has been keeping a secret for a long time and has finally been relieved of the burden of keeping it. "This is actually better for everyone, Rhett," he said. "You were never really built for this kind of thing anyway." I was 38 years old. I had spent 38 years being told, in the particular subtle language that families use when they mean something they won't say directly, that I wasn't built for things. Not built for college. Not built for the company. Not built for the boardroom. I fixed things. I climbed things. I worked with my hands. I was the Braddock who wore boots to Christmas dinner because I came straight from a job site. The Braddock who drove a 2012 F-150 with a cracked side mirror and a toolbox in the bed. The Braddock who was not, as my father had once said at a 4th of July cookout when he thought I was out of earshot, going to be leading anything. In the conference room on the 4th floor, behind the door I had just walked through and would never walk through again, were the documents that divided my father's estate. Glenn Braddock, 68 years old, had died 6 weeks earlier of a stroke in his study while reviewing quarterly reports. He had built Braddock Development Partners over 30 years, residential construction, commercial real estate, 4 apartment complexes, a strip mall in Mount Pleasant, and a partial ownership stake in a regional development firm worth approximately $27 million at time of death. The total estate just over $31 million. It went to my mother, Marlene, and my sister Cassidy, and my brother Tanner. Not to me. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because I had been disinherited in the conventional sense, but because the will, which had been drafted 7 months before my father died, and which nobody had told me existed until 30 minutes before I was asked to leave, contained a clause that our family attorney read aloud with the flat, professional calm of a man reading a grocery list. "This bequest is limited to biological descendants of Glenn Harlan Braddock." My mother looked at the table when he read it, not at me. At the table, she had the posture of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for a long time and had decided that the wood grain was easier than my face. Cassidy, my sister, who is 41 and has worked in the firm's finance department for 14 years, looked out the window. She had known, I could see it in the particular stillness of someone waiting for something they've already expected. There was no surprise in her body at all. And Tanner smiled. "I am Rhett Braddock, or that was the name I was given. I was born on September 3rd, 1987, and I was raised in a 4-bedroom colonial in the Riverland Terrace neighborhood of Charleston, 2 blocks from the water, in a house I had just been told I had no legal claim to. I grew up believing I was the middle child of Glenn and Marlene Braddock. Cassidy was 3 years older. Tanner was 4 years younger. We were a South Carolina family, old Charleston money on my mother's side, new Charleston money on my father's, the particular combination that produces children who know how to behave at charity galas and how to discuss property values at dinner. I believed I was one of them. I believed I had my father's jaw and my mother's height. I believed I had inherited Glenn's stubbornness and his preference for working with his hands. Glenn had started as a framing contractor before he built the company, and he still kept a tool belt in his office closet that he never wore anymore but also never threw away. I thought that tool belt was something we shared, a connection between us, a piece of evidence that we were made from the same material. I didn't go into the business. At 19, I started working for Palmetto Electric Cooperative, climbing poles, running lines, doing the physical work of keeping the lights on for people who never think about how the lights stay on. I've been doing it for 19 years. I make $61,000 a year. I own my truck outright, and I rent a house in North Charleston for $1,500 a month. I am, by every metric the Braddock family uses to evaluate a man, unremarkable. Cassidy runs numbers at the firm. Tanner handles client relations. I climb utility poles. The family story was clean. Cassidy got the brains, Tanner got the charm, Rhett got the work ethic but not the ambition. You know how Rhett is. I understand now why that story was so easy for them to tell. It is easy to call a man a middling achiever when you know he is not yours. It is easy to see a person's life choices as deficits when you decided long ago that you are not really responsible for how those choices turned out. I was the asterisk in the Braddock family narrative, the arrangement, the thing they had agreed to and then spent 38 years making peace with in their own private ways. I drove home from the attorney's office without turning on the radio. I took the long way down East Bay, along the waterfront, past the docks where cargo ships sit low in the Cooper River and the cranes move in that slow, purposeful way that makes you feel like you're watching something that has existed since before you were born and will keep existing after you're gone. I parked in my driveway and sat in the truck and looked at my hands on the steering wheel. Lineman's hands, callous from the work, scarred across the right palm from a wire incident in 2018, permanently rough no matter how much I washed them. My whole life I had thought those hands came from somewhere specific, from Glenn's genes, from a grandfather who had been a carpenter, from some inherited blueprint that made me good at physical work. If I was not Glenn Braddock's son, then that blueprint belonged to someone else entirely, someone I had never met, someone who did not know I existed. I needed to know whose hands these were. I found Leonard Pruitt through a Google search, private investigator, Charleston, SC, adoption records. His website was 3 pages and his reviews, 6 of them, all 5 stars, said things like found my birth family in 2 weeks and straightforward, no drama, knows the system. I called him the next morning from my truck parked outside the substation on Sproul Avenue before a 7 a.m. job. Pruitt Investigations. I need to find my biological parents. I found out yesterday that I was adopted. How old are you? 38. How much do you know? Nothing. My family had me removed from the will reading before anyone said a word. A pause, that's a rough way to find out. It was efficient. My rate is $175 up front plus expenses. If I come up empty, I refund the $170. South Carolina updated its adoptee disclosure laws in 2019. If the adoption was private, I go through agency archives or court records. Give me 10 days. Leonard Pruitt was 58 years old, a former investigator with the Charleston County Sheriff's Office who worked out of a shared office space on King Street above a sandwich shop. He was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of man who drinks coffee from a stainless thermos, returns calls within the hour, and says what he knows without embellishment. He filed the petition with the state and simultaneously contacted a network of county clerks and archived agency records he had spent 22 years building. On the 6th day, he called me while I was on a lift 60 feet off the ground on Highway 61, running new service wire to a subdivision that had been knocked out in a storm the week before. I've got the agency records. Private adoption, processed September 1987. Adoptive parents listed as Glenn and Marlene Braddock, Charleston. The original birth certificate names your biological mother. Her name is Solange Beaumont. She was 24 at the time of your birth. Louisiana-born, living in Charleston in 1987. Current address, Asheville, North Carolina. And my father? Leonard was quiet for 3 seconds. I noticed it because I was 60 feet in the air with nothing between me and the ground but the lift platform, and quiet has a different weight up there. Rhett, I need to make a second call before I give you the name. Why? Because the name on the birth certificate corresponds to a man whose involvement in this adoption doesn't look like a standard private placement. I want to cross-reference what I'm seeing in the corporate and property records before I tell you something that's going to change the way you understand your entire life. Can you give me 4 days? 4 days. I work them the way I always work, methodically. A transformer replacement on James Island, a pole inspection in Goose Creek, 3 hours of paperwork in the cooperative's break room, drinking bad coffee and thinking about nothing except the phone that wasn't ringing yet. On the morning of the 4th day, Leonard called. His voice was different, not the flat professional voice of a man who runs down records for a living. This was slower, heavier, the voice of someone who has found something that surprised even him and is still deciding how to carry the weight of it into a phone conversation. Rhett, are you somewhere you can sit down? I was in my truck in the parking lot of a Waffle House on Rivers Avenue at 7:15 in the morning, which is not a dignified place to receive life-altering news, but it is where I was. I'm sitting. Your biological father is listed on the original birth certificate. I've cross-referenced the name against corporate filings with the South Carolina Secretary of State, against property records in Charleston and Dorchester counties, and against the documented business relationship between his company and Braddock Development Partners going back to 1988. He paused. The cross-reference confirms what the certificate says. Leonard. Your biological father is Cyrus Alderman. Silence, my silence, not the silence of a man who doesn't understand what he has heard, the silence of a man whose mind is processing information that is too large for the pathway it's traveling through. It jams, it buffers. For approximately 4 seconds I sat in a Waffle House parking lot in North Charleston, and I didn't think a single thing. Cyrus Alderman, owner and founder of Alderman Structural, a steel fabrication and commercial construction supply company headquartered on Remount Road in North Charleston, one of the largest private employers in the Lowcountry, a man I had met exactly 5 times in my life at industry events and ribbon cuttings where Glenn Braddock had brought his family to stand in the background and look presentable. The Cyrus Alderman. He founded the company in 1982. In 1988, 1 year after you were born, he signed a 15-year preferred supplier agreement with Braddock Development Partners. That contract represented approximately 40% of Braddock's operating revenue for its first decade. It is, based on the records I've reviewed, the single business relationship that allowed Glenn Braddock's company to grow from a two-man framing operation into a regional developer worth $31 million. He built my father's company. He built it to stay near you. The contract renewals correspond precisely to your school years. The final renewal in 2009 expired the year you turned 22. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I didn't notice until I tried to drink it. There's more, Leonard said. Do you want it now? All of it. He had spent 4 days building the complete picture. Cyrus Alderman in 1987 was 31 years old, recently married to his wife Pauline, and running a steel company that was growing fast in the post-hurricane construction boom along the South Carolina coast. My biological mother Solange had been working as a draftsperson at an architectural firm that Alderman Structural regularly contracted with. The relationship lasted 8 months. When she became pregnant, the options were impossible from every direction they were approached. A married man with a young company and a wife who had just suffered a miscarriage, a young woman from Louisiana with no family in South Carolina and no desire to become a casualty of someone else's circumstances. The arrangement was made through an attorney. Private adoption. Cyrus and Solange would place the baby with a family of Cyrus's choosing. Glenn Braddock, who had been doing small framing jobs for Alderman Structural for 2 years and who Cyrus trusted, was offered the terms: adopt the child, raise him in Charleston where Cyrus could remain in the same professional orbit, and receive in exchange a preferred supplier contract that would transform Braddock Development Partners into a real company. Solange received a settlement of $180,000 and relocated to Asheville. The deal was clean. Glenn raised the child. Cyrus watched from the permitted distance of a business associate, 15 feet at ribbon cuttings across a banquet hall at industry dinners, through a car window on a highway once when I was up on a pole and he pulled over without me knowing. He had one biological child. Me. He and Pauline never had children together. She had known about the arrangement since 1989. She had agreed to it because the alternative was losing the marriage. I drove to the Alderman Structural headquarters the next morning. I had passed that building 400 times in 19 years of working in the area. The logo on the trucks, the name on the sign, the fabrication shop visible from Remount Road. I had never once understood that the name on the building was the name on my birth certificate. I walked to the front desk and told the receptionist my name. Tell Mr. Alderman that Rhett Braddock is here. He'll know what it's about. She picked up the phone, said my name, listened, said yes, sir, and put it down. He'll be right down. Cyrus Alderman was 68 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way men who started in fabrication shops are broad, not gym broad, work broad, the kind of build that comes from decades of physical labor before the company grew large enough to put him behind a desk. He had gray hair cut close and the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for something so long that when it finally arrives, he doesn't know how to move toward it. He looked at me the way I had seen him look at me exactly 5 times in my life, at those industry events and construction site openings, when I had been standing next to Glenn and assuming Cyrus Alderman was just being polite to the boss's son. Now I understood what that look had always been. He was counting. You know, he said, not a question. I know. He pressed his lips together, his jaw tightened, and then, standing in the lobby of the company he built from one shop and a clipboard, in front of his receptionist and a wall of framed project photos spanning 38 years, Cyrus Alderman did something I was not prepared for. He put one hand over his mouth. His eyes went wet. He looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds, and when he looked back at me, the face of a 68-year-old company founder was the face of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. Come to my office, he said, please. We sat across from each other at a conference table overlooking the fabrication floor. Through the glass below us, men were cutting steel and running welds, doing the work that had funded the contract that had funded the company that had funded the house I grew up in, the entire architecture of my childhood visible from that one window. I watched you on a pole once, he said. Highway 17, just south of the county line. You were maybe 26. I recognized you from the road. I pulled over and watched for about 10 minutes. He paused. You were very efficient, no wasted movement, the kind of worker who has already figured out the economy of a task. I didn't say anything. At the Somerville ribbon cutting when you were 14, you remember? You shook my hand. I remember. Before that, I had watched you spend 20 minutes helping one of the site foremen restring a safety barrier that came loose in the wind. Nobody asked you. You just saw something that needed fixing and you fixed it. He looked at his own hands on the table. I told you that you had good hands. I said it because it was all I was allowed to say, and because it was the truest thing I knew about you at that moment. I thought you were just being polite to Glenn's kid. I know, he was quiet for a long moment. I have driven past your school, past your worksite, past your apartment on Montague, not to intrude, just to see. 3 drives past that school when you were 14, I counted them for years afterward, told myself 3 was better than 0. That seeing you through a car window was better than never. That good hands at a ribbon cutting was better than nothing. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. Nothing was the alternative, and nothing was what the deal required of me. Why didn't you break the deal? Because Glenn kept his end of it. He raised you. He kept you in this city, and I was a coward who convinced himself every year that next year would be the year something changed, and every year nothing changed because I never changed anything. He looked at me directly. Glenn is gone now. The deal was with Glenn, and the second his family used his death to do what they did to you in that conference room, my silence stopped being honorable and started being its own kind of crime. I asked him about Solange. He told me what he knew. She drove to Charleston twice in the first 5 years, he said. She called me both times. The second time, she sat outside your school, watched recess for about 20 minutes from her car. She called me that night and she said she saw you chasing another kid across the blacktop, laughing. She said that was enough. That was the last time she called. I drove to Asheville 2 weeks later. I found the studio Beaumont Clay on Lexington Avenue in the River Arts District in 45 seconds online. I parked on the street and sat in my truck for 7 minutes. Then I walked in. The studio smelled like damp earth and wood smoke. Shelves of bowls and mugs and vases in deep blues and earth tones lined every wall. A woman at the wheel in the back of the space, her hands deep in clay, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing an apron covered in the accumulated color of years of work. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. She looked at my face. She stood from the wheel slowly, the way people stand when their legs aren't sure the moment is real. She did not say my name. She put her clay-covered hands over her mouth, exactly the way Cyrus had put his hand over his in his company lobby, and I understood that this was not a coincidence, that some gestures are not learned but carried, that I was looking at the woman I had learned it from without ever knowing her. She crossed the floor in 8 steps, and she held me the way people hold each other when the waiting is finally completely done. She was shaking. Probably I was too. We sat for 2 hours in the back of the studio drinking tea she made on a small electric burner while clay dried on her hands, and she didn't bother to wipe it off. She cried twice. I cried once, which is more than I have cried in the last 20 years combined, so I'm counting it separately. She told me about 1987, about being 24 and alone in a city that wasn't hers and making a decision that felt impossible from every direction, about the drive to Charleston and the school and the blacktop and the boy chasing someone across it laughing, and how she sat in her car and decided that the cruelest thing she could do was interrupt a life that appeared, from the outside, to be working. "Were you happy?" she asked me. I thought about it honestly. I thought I was. I didn't know what I didn't know. She looked at me for a long moment. That might be the most honest answer to that question I've ever heard. Her dog, a brown mutt named Biscuit, came out from a back room halfway through and put his head in my lap. I scratched his ears without thinking about it, the way you do when animals choose you. My mother watched me do it with an expression I have no single word for. Something between relief and grief, and something that doesn't have a name yet, but that I recognized because I felt it too. We are having dinner next month, a real one, at a table with time. Marlene called 3 weeks after I visited Cyrus's office. The corporate filings for a revised ownership structure at Alderman Structural had appeared in the public record, and the construction industry is a small world in the Low Country. "Rhett, I'm seeing something about Cyrus Alderman. Is that—" "Yes." "You're his son?" "His only biological child." The silence on the other end was not empty. It was full of the conference room and the man in the blazer and Tanner's slow smile and her own eyes fixed on the table instead of my face. "Rhett, I want you to know that Glenn did love you, whatever the arrangement was. The test of a parent," I said, "isn't how they love you when everything is comfortable. It's what they do at the end when the money is on the table. Glenn made sure the money excluded me. That's his answer." I paused. "For the record, my name is being legally updated to reflect my biological parentage. If you need to reach me about anything, you can go through my attorney. Have a good evening, Marlene." I used her first name for the first time in my life. She heard it exactly the way I meant it. Tanner called the day after, then again. On the 3rd attempt, he left a voicemail that began with, "Listen, I think we need to clear some things up," and I deleted it before he finished the sentence. There was nothing to clear up. Everything was already clear. That was the problem, from his perspective. I am not angry. That is the truest thing I can tell you about where I am right now. I expected to be angry, and I'm not. What I am is clear. Clarity arrived the same way everything arrives when you've been waiting for it without knowing you were waiting, not gradually but all at once, like a circuit completing. And what I see clearly now is exactly what each person showed me when they thought I was nobody. Marlene looked at the table. Cassidy looked out the window. Tanner smiled. Those are their real faces. I had been looking at their performance faces for 38 years, and I mistook the performance for the person. I don't make that mistake anymore. I'm still working at Palmetto Electric. Cyrus asked me once if I wanted to come into the company immediately, and I told him no, not yet. He nodded, the nod of a man who expected that answer and respects it. I'm not ready to walk into a steel company and pretend I know what I'm doing. I climb poles, I run wire. I keep lights on for people who never think about the lights. I am good at that work, and I am not done with it. But I drive out to Alderman Structural on Tuesday mornings now. Cyrus walks me through the fabrication floor, the offices, the contracts and accounts, and the business of turning raw material into something that holds weight. He is patient the way men are patient when they know they are running out of time and have decided to spend what they have carefully. Last Tuesday, at the end of the walkthrough, we stood at the edge of the fabrication floor watching a crew finish a structural beam order for a hospital project in Colombia. Loud in there, the kind of loud that makes conversation harder and somehow more honest, because you have to lean in and mean what you say. I drove past that school 3 times in 1 week when you were 14, he said. I told myself 3 drives was better than 0, that a car window was better than nothing. He watched the crew work for a moment. I counted those 3 drives for a long time after. I looked at him. You don't have to count anymore. He looked back at me the way a man looks when something he has needed to hear finally arrives in a language he understands. I know, he said, I still will, every Tuesday, every phone call, every single one. The Braddocks told me I was never built for their kind of life. Maybe they were right about that. But the man who built himself from one fabrication shop and a clipboard into a company with his name on the building, who drove past a school 3 times in a week just to catch a glimpse of his son from a moving car, that man built the same way I build. One day, one connection, no wasted movement. I have his hands, I always did. I just didn't know whose they were until a 175 private investigator made a phone call that changed every answer I had ever given about myself. I know now, and I'm not wasting a single day I have left to use them.